So today's class is based on a session from last year, so I'm in kind of last year's format. It's built around four sets of biblical texts. We'll get to them a little bit. But before we even get to that, I guess I wanted to ask you a general question, just your impression about the Bible now that we've gotten this far through the class, which is most of the way through the class. Here's the question. Who do you think read Bible stories and when? And you think, well, what kind of question is that? Like, wouldn't everybody read them? So here's kind of what I mean. Do you think that women and men read Bible stories together? Or heard them together? Or not? Do you think that children were included in hearing Bible stories? Would families read Bible stories together? Now, of course, there's the question of who actually knew how to read, so I'm a little bit going to have to be flexible about, are we talking about actual texts or stories repeated from texts that people had heard elsewhere? But even the textual aspect that van der Toorn talks about is part of the question, in that he'd say, of course, that these are especially produced by scribes, and then we've talked about how they might read them in the temple or at special occasions. So, what do you think? What do you picture? This is not a kind of right or wrong answer type question. You get the seriousness of the question about who would read Bible texts, Bible stories? Is it a family-friendly sort of thing to do? Yeah?
You're asking modern times? Or?
No, ancient times. I'm talking about ancient times.
I think
Yeah.
Van der Toorn, he kind of showed that like it was for the scribal elite, like it was for the people who knew how to read, of course.
Which is a very, thing. Van der Toorn shows that you have to picture the scribal elite. For sure you have to picture the scribal elite being those who are producing the texts. And then a question is, how far do they circulate? And how does anybody else get to hear them? And so at a certain point, of course, the Bible becomes a pretty big deal. Even the text we read the other day with Nehemiah talking about Ezra the scribe standing up and reading the Torah. Who is he? Do you remember what the answer to the question would have been there? Like if I asked this question for Nehemiah and what we read last time.
People.
It said everybody, right? In fact, do you think that everybody included women? I don't remember now what it actually says. I thought it did. Mari's going to look.
Isn't like the Hebrew word for everybody?
Says in it on. Yeah, so there's no grammatical problem if it says everybody with it, including men and women. But yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly how it describes it. So then you could say, well, how about children? Would it even include children? So this is this question. Any other reactions to this? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, whenever I've heard of scribes reading out loud to groups of people, and I feel like it's always a mix of men, women, and children. It's always in a public space, or that's
Yeah.
the idea of it, like outside in the middle of a courtyard or something. Where everyone's-
Okay.
I don't think you could weed out the children and the women. It just
Yeah.
It's
So-
so long. Like it wouldn't make sense.
Yes, this is, again, at least trying to picture the public reading sort of thing. And I like that train of thought to think, well, if it's going to be a public reading, then how do you exclude anybody, right? For it not to include women and children, for instance, then you'd almost have to create a social situation where they could not come. And would any of the pictures of recitation in the Bible or the ways you imagine this from just other settings fit that? I don't know what you were going to
Oh, I just
say.
had a question about the question. Is the question who's the intended audience of the Bible? Like who's the intended reader?
It is partly who is the intended audience, but of course, yeah, I mean, then that is related to how it's actually read. Yeah. And so, at least if you look at, for instance, the Nehemiah, did you check it out?
Yeah. The people of the land, their wives, their sons, their daughters.
Okay, so there you go. The people of the land, their wives, their sons, their daughters. So it's consciously including everybody. I had this memory of it being inclusive, and I didn't remember the wording. But so, for instance, in that Nehemiah type example, then it gives you a particular setting. It's a public festival. They read it out loud, so they're not actually consuming it because they know how to read, but there's somebody reading it for them. And then that goes back to the previous observation that once you start picturing that public reading type setting, then you think, well, how do you exclude people? And I mean, one would be, for instance, if you had a reading that was associated with a muster for war or something like that, that could end up being just for men. But then you could start to ask, well, what about stories? Like all the stories? Would you read all the stories? This is the law. There's nothing. I mean, it may bore you to tears, and may put all the kids to sleep, and they may want to run around and scream. But there's nothing that's not G-rated, pretty much. Well, actually, once you start thinking about it. That's right. This is where you try to put them asleep before you hit them with the list in Leviticus of all the sexual acts that are not supposed to be performed between what creatures, humans and other humans, or sometimes not humans. So, I mean, there are parts of even the law that would get a little dicey if you put it that way. But in a way, this is all to say that today's topic is some of the stuff that you might wonder about being family reading in the Bible. And so whether you're talking about the law and the list in, what is it, like Leviticus 19 or something like that, about deviant sexual behavior, and it is, go look at Leviticus 19 if you're interested. It is there, and we're not going to talk about it today. But there are stories that involve very strange sexual pictures. The interesting thing about the Bible, I suppose, is that whatever you might picture for what the Bible's like, after all, it's a religious book, right? It should be all really straightforward. It should all be really family-friendly. Don't you want to raise your kids? Didn't your parents want to raise you to be like this? Well, I mean, you don't have to answer this question. Maybe your parents, what do you mean? Like, I'm not using that as a guide. But at least you wouldn't complain about other people reading it. It would all be pretty straightforward. But the funny thing is that whatever your relationship to the Bible and your own history and your own family, you might think as a stereotype that sex would be kind of a dangerous topic for the Bible, because it would be kind of a dangerous topic for religion. But in fact, the Bible's all over sex. It's not a taboo topic at all in the Bible. And so today's topic of the day is when you talk about sex in the Bible. And so I could have chosen a lot of other stuff. In fact, with the Jonathan and David, Gilgamesh and Enkidu topic, that was kind of, that was related, although on the Bible side, I mean, you might all conclude that sex was not actually what was at stake there. But we're going to deal with some texts today in the Bible where sex is what they're talking about. There is no doubt about it. And the question is, what's going on? Why are they talking about sex? How should we be reading this? And I guess my point will be that there are different reasons for talking about sex in the Bible. And I want you to catch them, because when you hear it, and when you think about why they're doing it, then you get a kind of a glimpse of their whole social world, because sex is about relationships. And so with each kind of way of bringing up the topic, they're involved with some powerful issue of identity and relationships in ancient Israel and Judah. So with all that said, Why don't we start in? I'll tell you in advance. I've got 3 texts or sets of texts. The first is a book that's called The Song of Songs, which is one of the strangest books in the Bible, mainly because it's a little bit hard to figure out why it's in the Bible. The second is a story that we at least encountered once before, I think, which is in Genesis chapter 30, and it's one part of the birth sequence between Leah and Rachel and the 2 servants. But there's a particular episode that involves Leah and Rachel trading for sex. Then the next passage or passages, it's a pair of passages about Sodom and Gomorrah and this guy named Lot, who's related to Abraham. And then there's a little bit less known story that I'm trying to remember we may have talked about in Judges chapter 19, which is before the war with Benjamin. And those 2 are related in some way. And then finally we'll get to sex and the prophets and look at texts from Hosea and Ezekiel. So, I could have started anywhere in this book. Song of Songs, I'm trying to remember how many chapters it is. It's, 11 chapters or something. But it goes on and on in kind of the same vein. So just in general, when you're reading this, so the line at the top, the lover to his beloved, is not part of the actual text. That's just an aid from the editors to help you know where you are. Especially in this text, it's a little bit hard to follow because you have 2 conversation partners, and there's a man and a woman, and it just goes back and forth. And the question is it the guy or is it the woman? And occasionally you get a kind of like a Greek chorus type voice that seems to be from outside. But so now here is the man. Oh, you are beautiful, my darling. Oh, you are beautiful. Your eyes behind your veil are like doves. Your hair is like a flock of female goats descending from Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of newly shorn sheep. The nicest of compliments. Coming up from the washing place, each of them has a twin, and not one of them is missing. You had to go a long way maybe to find somebody who didn't have any missing. Your lips are like a scarlet thread. Your mouth is lovely. Your forehead behind your veil is like a slice of pomegranate. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with courses of stones. 1,000 shields are hung on it, all shields of valiant warriors. Your 2 breasts are like 2 fawns, twins of the gazelle grazing among the lilies. Until the dawn arrives and the shadows flee, I will go up to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. You are altogether beautiful, my darling. There is no blemish in you. Come with me from Lebanon, my bride. And then he keeps inviting her to come with him. Go down a bit more. I'm trying to remember what comes next. You've stolen my heart, my sister, my bride. This came up in the first paper, by the way, when he uses the brother language in the poem. And some people said, oh, well, he says brother, so it can't be sexual. Well, that alone may not settle it. How much better is your love than wine? The fragrance of your perfume is better than any spice. Your lips drip sweetness like the honeycomb, my bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue. And then you are a locked garden, my sister, my bride. You are an enclosed spring. Well, so on it goes. And because the language is so full of physical images of things from nature, then you have to judge just how intimate the metaphors may actually be, but pretty intimate, probably. Once you start describing her breasts and her smell, it's hard to know exactly how far you're supposed to picture them going. But to some extent, this is a text without a plot. It's a conversation, titillating, at least to them, You had to be there. Use your imagination. It's pretty direct. And it goes back and forth. They get to the end. It's not as if they just are moving to some consummation at the end. It just all sort of plays out in this mass of, heavy breathing and all this intense imagery. So here's my question for you. And again, this is not as if you would just know. Why is this in the Bible? Why is this in the Bible? And it's not like you missed something. If I turn the pages, I didn't give you the God part. There is no God part. There is no Israel part. Why is it in the Bible? Go ahead, yeah.
Is it kind of relating Israel's marriage to God?
Okay, so this is one traditional explanation, which would be to treat it as an allegory for the people's relationship to their God. And it's in the Bible. It's a fair place to go because you think otherwise, how could I explain how it's there? It's an interesting picture because, for one, if it's true, let's just go with it. Is this people's actual relationship to God? There are traditions that were kind of gone. There are certain monastic Christian traditions that kind of went that way. But if you thought, is this all about this kind of physical desire that goes both ways? God has that desire for his people, and that it's kind of about this physicality. There's no focus on character or what kind of person you are or interesting conversation. Or it's just interesting. Even if you take it that way, it's still a little bit awkward. Absolutely, people have. The text itself never, if you found this text outside the Bible, there wouldn't be anything in the text itself to take you there, which is part of the challenge. Can you think of any other reason? I mean, that actually could be the one most obvious reason, that somebody came along and at least explained it that way. It's not impossible. Got any other ideas? Yeah.
I guess it could be a very colorful encouragement of marriage because
Yeah, there's another.
my bride, repetitively, so it would be kind of encouraging that covenant between people, and marriage is wonderful.
You could take it as right? So this would be another direction to go that wouldn't involve God, and the advantage of that interpretation is that God's not in the text. So you could say, all right, so it's actually about the union of the man and woman, and you define that as an encouragement of marriage. I'll come back to that. But yeah, go ahead.
Guide on how to get girls in the Bible?
So say that again.
Guide on how to get girls in the Bible? As in,
Does
as in,
yeah. Wasn't quite sure how to answer. But go ahead.
as in, to show that people in the Bible, that love is not something that should be held back. You can express your love. You don't have to be
Yeah. I mean, actually, this is interesting the way you put it, because you didn't mention marriage. So why would I like your interpretation more than her interpretation?
because it's polygamy.
Because there's polygamy. Well, I was going to say something else, which is that you actually didn't mention marriage until I asked about it. Then you said polygamy. You just said that there was this relationship and everything like that. The only thing about the marriage business is that marriage actually isn't mentioned. I mean, there's all this business about my bride, though it's not clear that they actually are married. It's all in the attraction. And so the text is very occupied with that attraction, and much more occupied with just the attraction between a man and a woman than with marriage per se. And it's a sexual attraction, absolutely. And the text celebrates that. It doesn't back away from it at all. And it doesn't worry about whether it's okay and exactly how it should be consummated. It's a little bit unclear in the text where the boundaries are in terms of the contact they've had. It's a little bit unclear whether they've had sex and there's just the anticipation of seeing each other again, or whether they haven't because they aren't actually married. It's an open question, maybe, but whichever way you go with that, it's not occupied with those problems. Somebody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Do you feel like also maybe the actual author assumes that this would happen within an actual marriage? I mean, even though he doesn't use the word marriage, he says my bride.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the author assumes that it would happen within a marriage, although it is interesting, again, if we read the whole text, and you can get a little bit of a hint of this. Even the you are a locked garden. Well, of course, it's a good question where that goes. But there's this ongoing sense of distance between them, where they have contact and then they're not together and then they have contact. It is more the situation outside of a marriage, at least, where they don't live together, they don't share that space automatically, or at least it's not treated that way. It's more than this desire that's partly created by separation. Though not necessarily, an absolute separation. It again seems like he's been close enough, or they've been close enough to know each other physically at some level. And it's very ambiguous at that. It's hard to know where to place it and what kind of expectations we should imagine for sex between them and sort of what the social boundaries are on that. Any other reactions? Go ahead.
Yeah, we normally see, I normally see the Bible in a society as really stone cold and really morally rigid, so seeing this is kind of different. But I'm also wondering how much of this is just an overblown rendering? Would this work in an actual ancient Israelite society? Could you say this to a girl and she'll
Oh, I love what you said about my teeth. And thank you, I do have them all. Yeah. I mean, I guess this is one of those unanswerable questions, right? Let's see, can we use a time machine here? Or maybe not. But of course, if it didn't work at all, why say it? Although, again, if you go back to Van der Toorn in the world of professional scribes, then you think, okay, for one, maybe this is a guy text. And so maybe this is trying out lines that would never work on a girl. So, yeah, it's a good question. You should, I think, though, whatever the answer is to your question, you should let the text surprise you in terms of your expectations of the Bible, because it's in the Bible, and it's not as if you can say, oh, well, but it's in some tiny dark corner where no one would find it. No, there it is. It seems like people would know it. And in fact, this guy, David Carr, who's Mari's former teacher, has even observed that there are a lot of language connections between the book of Hosea, which is one of the earliest prophetic books, and this book. So whichever way those connections go, there's a kind of shared audience between a prophetic book and a sex book. But, yeah.
Okay, based on that, so you know we spoke about how the Torah is divided into 3 sections?
Or the Tanakh, the whole, yeah.
So, I mean, the question of whether we should read it as an allegory or take it literally, I mean, does that come into play here? Because,
It's a good question where it is. So, I mean, this is, again, it's not part of the Torah or the prophets. It's in the Ketuvim, which is the writings at the end. And so it is, it can't be an accident that that's where it's found, right? That there was nothing about its themes to put it with the law or teaching. There was nothing about its story or its sense of the relationship between God and Israel to put it in the Nevi'im, the prophets. And it is the Ketuvim, the writings, that include a kind of, not exactly catch-all, but a collection of everything else that was felt to belong And so it is in this category that they also recognize as different. And yet, I mean, it includes the book of Ruth who's there, but also Ezra and Nehemiah are there. And there's all this other stuff. The Psalms, Proverbs are there. It was no less a book because it was in that set of the collection. So here's the thing, at least, just to get right off. I mean, get to the point of this one first category, which is that at some level, this book seems to be a piece of literature for pleasure. And so whatever else, I mean, whether it's got the allegory thing or the encouragement of marriage thing or just talking about desire and attraction and that's okay, no problem with that, or whether it's just about desire and attraction and it's not saying it's okay, it's just talking about it because it's titillating, it's attractive, it's, I don't know, entertaining. So at some level in the Song of Songs, no matter what other interpretation you have for this book, I think we have talk about sex for pleasure. It's not for some other reason. And that's why I put this book first, just to get that on the table, that the Bible is capable of presenting us a piece of literature that talks about sex because it's fun to talk about, which may be not what you think about the Bible. And they talk about it a little differently than we might, but it's a lot more explicit than people would expect for the Bible. It's not as explicit in some ways as some other sort of sexual literature, sexual poetry, love poetry from Egypt and Mesopotamia. But it's not way off. So let's go to the second one. All right, so that first one is one reason to talk about sex in the Bible, and maybe in the ancient world, there's other literature like this outside of the Bible, is for pleasure. So the second text is the Genesis 30. And this is going to be a serious shifting of gears. So it's also talking about sex, and it doesn't shy away from the specifics, but totally different. Let's see. So you just combine a bunch of stuff. All right. So we're only looking at, don't even look at 19 and below. That'll be coming. So just those top lines. And I don't know if you remember, right? But there was this. So Jacob has two wives, Leah and Rachel. Leah's the older one, but he loves Rachel. Leah is allowed to have children first. Rachel can't have any. In fact, by this point in the story, Leah's had several sons, and Rachel has not had any. They've traded giving their husband Jacob their own sort of women servants as substitutes, and so they've had kids by Jacob. Everybody's had a kid by Jacob except for Rachel. But in spite of the fact that that's where we are in the story, that at this point, I think Leah has 4 sons, and each of the 2 servants has 2 sons. So here you go. You get to this point. At the time of the wheat harvest, Reuben, and this is Leah's oldest son, went out and found some mandrake plants in a field and brought them to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, "Give me some of your son's mandrakes." And you might think, well, why? Why would you want mandrakes? And what are mandrakes? But it doesn't matter even. They're a plant, right? So here you go. He's been out and he's found mandrakes. And Leah says, "Wasn't it enough that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes too?" What do you think she means by taking away her husband?
Rachel's the one with the affection of Jacob.
Yeah.
Leah lacks that. So Jacob at this point in the story is no longer visiting Leah.
Yeah.
She's already had 4 sons by him.
Yeah. So absolutely the affection, but nicely put with the visiting, right? But absolutely, right? I mean, that's the problem. And that the reason I emphasize the discrete reference to visiting is that's what's at stake here, is the visiting, and that the Bible's talking about it. And it builds one part of the birth story around it, right? So not only that, of course, this has to happen in order for the various sons to be born. But that in this one part of the story, it becomes an issue, right? Who gets him? Like, who gets access to this guy? And so what's interesting is that they both want that. And I mean, I suppose I could say, well, why do they want it? But I mean, it's sort of a rhetorical question, right? Aside from anything else, they want it so they can have a son. It's not even just the physical pleasure or question of, I don't know, the relationship with the husband. They want sons. And so this is why she says, wasn't it enough that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes too? All right, Rachel said, he may sleep with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came, so far as somehow the mandrakes might be associated with her hoping to be fertile, then this would apparently be what Rachel is after. But of course, what actually happens, when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must sleep with me because I have paid for your services with my son's mandrakes." You like that? It's in the Bible. What you're supposed to do. This is how you handle such issues. Of course, you have to imagine a polygamous kind of arrangement to start. But, okay. So he had marital relations. He visited with her that night. God paid attention to Leah. She became pregnant and gave Jacob a son for the 5th time. And then Leah said, "God has granted me a reward because I gave my servant to my husband as a wife." I don't know why that should be a reward. So she named him Issachar. So Leah gets the son. So again, I mean, there are different issues that we could focus on, but what I'm doing today is looking at the question of why talk about sex in the Bible, but in the ancient world. The Bible is just convenient because it gives us all these stories that include this. And if you want to talk about sex in the actual setting of Israel and Judah as opposed to Egypt or Mesopotamia or something like that, then we got it. Let's go with it, right? So why are they talking about sex here? What would you say? Why? Yeah, okay.
Does all it seems to tie back to having children?
Ties back to having children.
Yeah, the sons. Which
Okay.
At the same time, there is this, I mean, Leah has already had a bunch of sons, and she still wants to see.
Yeah. It is sort of interesting. She's already had a bunch of sons. So it's tied up with that. Do you think she wants to have sex with Jacob so as to have a 5th son?
I mean, I don't get that impression, but.
Other reactions to that question? Or anything else connected to this one? So, I mean, there's still the, why talk about sex, but yeah.
The thing with this text, like the whole section with Leah and Rachel and Jacob, is that when you look especially the etymology of the sons' names, it seems more as though they're competing for Jacob's affection, as opposed to Leah is in particular competing for Jacob's affection, whereas Rachel's the one who wants sons. Because Leah explicitly mentions that she loves Jacob, Rachel does not. Rachel just wants children. So it's a different, from each wife, you get a different perspective.
Yeah, that's a nice idea. And this is intriguing too, right? Because Jacob is said to love Rachel and not love Leah. Leah does say, well, I mean, at least, I'm trying to remember what it says, but I mean, she complains that Rachel has taken away her husband. She wants him, and yet in a way, from context, you could say she's had 4 sons. I mean, maybe she wants a 5th son, but it kind of seems like she just wants him, and the sexual connection is an expression of that. And his refusal of it is flip side, like the most visible sign of his rejection of her. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like each of the sisters wants what they don't have.
Everybody wants, they want what they don't have. Yeah, typical enough, right? So if you say, why talk about the sex? could you do this without being so explicit? What do you get by emphasizing it? Let me run a couple things by you. Two main observations for this context. First of all, for women, sex is access to security, status, and power when it's built into a sanctioned, permanent relationship, which is a statement that I kind of wrote carefully, that sex is access to security, status, and power when it is built into a sanctioned, permanent relationship. It's interesting to think about this in relation to the Song of Songs, where these sorts of issues just don't seem to be in play. The whole issue of the relationship, the permanent relationship, the whole marriage issue, that's completely missing from the Song of Songs. It's just not what it's interested in. But in this text, that's entirely what it's about. But the intriguing thing is that you're dealing with a competition between two women, both of whom have this they have the marriage, they have the permanent sanctioned relationship, the accepted, socially accepted relationship. But they don't both have the sex. And they need it, not just for the children. And yet, an expression of this security, status, and even you could say power, is the children who will represent their interests. So one of the interesting aspects of this story here is that it's Reuben, Leah's own son, who ends up being the means by which she gets access to his father, right, for his mother. So her son, the fruit of a successful relationship before, becomes her advocate in this very sort of ongoing exchange. And the second point is that Jacob's love for Rachel over Leah means that Rachel has his bed, and that Leah has to buy the right from her. So if you go back even to the Jonathan and David thing, it doesn't mean that love is always about sex, and it doesn't mean that the Jonathan and David love is about sex. But one of the things I tried to get you to see in that passage was how the language of love was not just a sort of fuzzy blend of feelings that go back and forth equally in some kind of bond, but that they used this language to communicate very specific ideas about a relationship that had to do with commitments. And in this case, when it says that Jacob loved Rachel, then that represents a choice that's played out in his excluding Leah and being with Rachel sexually. So this would mean that talk about sex in marriage focuses on whether the woman actually has the access to her husband to gain these benefits. So sex is a crucial transaction for women in marriage. Not necessarily totally a thing of the past. Okay, so in this so with first text I said, well, you talk about sex for pleasure, for entertainment. But in this case, we're talking about sex as a crucial part of women's lives, in that it is essential to their finding a successful and secure place in the world. Not just to be married, but to have sex with their husbands. And in order to talk about this, the tension in this story, right, is between all the sort of layerings of relationships between each of the women and their husband Jacob, and between each other, not to mention Reuben as a son and the servants. But the most powerful way to talk about the tensions in that relationship is through the sex, where the whole thing kind of plays out. And that's a reason to talk about it, and to talk about it explicitly. Ready for another round? It's in the rest of this page. All right, so number 3, like third category. So these are a pair of texts. And it's even very likely, and there's been a long debate about how these two are related. You'll see when we look at them both that they've got to be related in some way. The most likely explanation is that the Genesis one is earlier, and that the Judges one was told with reference to the Genesis one. So this is actually, the story would pick up well before this. So in the storyline, we're at a point where Abraham, the first ancestor of Israel that goes back before Jacob, is the main character. And so there's this ongoing question of his inability to have a son or to have children. But at a certain point, then we find him, at home in his tent. And these 3 figures show up to meet him, one of whom turns out to be God, or at least to speak with God's voice. And they meet with Abraham, and they start off by promising Sarah that she'll have a son, which she laughs at because she says, after all, I'm 86 years old. Well, that's a little bit of 86 is pretty old for that, you'd think. It'd be, whatever. I won't even go farther with that one, right? But gives you more time, right? But after that exchange, where they're left with Sarah expecting that, well, okay, they said so, who knows what's going to happen now. 2 of the figures, the ones that don't talk for God, drift off to this place called Sodom that maybe you've heard about. And the other one hangs around and talks to Abraham and talks in God's voice. And God says, I'm about to destroy these places. And of course, for one, Abraham knows that his nephew Lot lives in one of them, which is Sodom. And so for that reason alone, I think he's a little nervous about the notion that God's just going to wipe them off the face of the earth, because Lot and his people all live there. So he keeps trying to talk him down, What if there are some good people there? Would you still wipe out the city? And God says, no, if there's 50 good people, I wouldn't wipe it out. But the number keeps decreasing, and finally it seems pretty clear he's going to wipe out the city. So the next thing you know, the scene shifts, and these 2 figures that are somehow angels, but appear just as men, show up at Lot's doorstep in Sodom, in the city of Sodom. And this is what you hear. He brings them in to his house, and so there these 2 figures are for the night. And of course, if anybody realized they were angels, they might have behaved differently, but they just look like guys. So before they could lie down to sleep, all the men, both young and old, from every part of the city of Sodom, surrounded the house. They shouted to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we can have sex with them." Lot went outside to them, shutting the door behind him. He said, "No, my brothers, don't act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never had sexual relations with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do to them whatever you please." He doesn't offer himself. "Only don't do anything to these men, for they've come under the protection of my roof." Unlike my daughters, I guess, right? Would not want. they get back at him later, right? At the end of the story. Out of our way, they cried, and this man came to live here as a foreigner, and now he dares to judge us. We'll do more harm to you than to them. They kept pressing in on Lot until they were close enough to break down the door. So the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house as they shut the door. And then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, from youngest to oldest, with blindness. The men outside wore themselves out trying to find the door. And then the story kind of moves on, that Lot is in a position at that point to take his whole family, daughters included, and flee the city before the whole place gets destroyed. But of course, the part of the story that's most memorable is this notion. Well, the whole notion of this mob wanting to have sex with his two male guests. And then the other part that's sort of revolting is the notion that he says, no, don't do anything to them. Take my daughters, which is equally shocking. And then the story moves on. Now, in the other story, did we talk about Judges 19 before? Do you remember this? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, right? So this is before this war with Benjamin. It's the end of the book of Judges. One of the things that's so strange about the larger story is that this one tribe of Benjamin ends up going to war with the entire group of Israel. But in the final form of the text where we have it now, it's introduced by a story that's trying to explain to us why there would be this war. And so it all revolves around this place called Gibeah, which would have been the capital of Benjamin. And so it says, well, this terrible thing happened at Gibeah, just like what happened at Sodom. And so at this point, there's this guy, the Levite. He's got a concubine that he just managed to retrieve. They got over their divorce. And so she agrees to go back with him. And on the way back home, he decides to spend the night at Gibeah, which is the capital of Benjamin. And this is what happens. They were having a good time when suddenly some men of the city, some good-for-nothings, surrounded the house and kept beating on the door. Sound familiar? They said to the old man who owned the house, "Send out the man who came to visit you so we can have sex with him." Again, this guy's ended up in somebody's house who's playing his host and who doesn't want to hand him over. The man who owned the house went outside and said to them, "No, my brothers, don't do this wicked thing. After all, this man is a guest in my house. Don't do such a disgraceful thing. Here are my virgin daughter and my guest's concubine. I will send them out, and you can abuse them and do to them whatever you like." It seems to be a custom, at least a storytelling motif. "But don't do such a disgraceful thing to this man." The men refused to listen to him, so the Levite grabbed his concubine and made her go outside. They raped her and abused her all night long until morning. They let her go at dawn. The woman arrived back at daybreak and was sprawled out on the doorstep of the house where her master was staying until it became light. When her master got up in the morning, opened the doors of the house, and went outside to start on his journey, there was the woman, his concubine, sprawled out on the doorstep of the house with her hands on the threshold. Remember, of course, that he knows she's been out. He stuck her there, right? He said to her, "Get up, let's leave," but there was no response. He put her on the donkey and went home. It's not even clear whether she's alive or dead, which is part of the disgusting aspect of the story. When he got home, he took a knife, grabbed his concubine, and carved her up into 12 pieces. Then he sent the pieces throughout Israel. And then this is the basis. I mean, he as the story has it, everybody gets a piece of concubine and thinks, "Oh no, Gibeah has done a terrible thing." Like, what would you think? Like, who is this guy? So one of the ideas, just as an aside, that I had when I first talked about this with Lauren Monroe, a former student of mine, was that I began to wonder if the story could have been told from a Benjamin point of view. Remember, Gibeah's they're the victims of all this. I mean, they're the ones who are said to be doing this, because one could ask the question, not how awful is Benjamin, but how awful is the guy that did this? But aside from that, we've got this same motif of the violence, the sexual violence done toward these guests, or at least desired with these guests. So, what do you think? Why use sex here? Why introduce sex into this story? Like, what's really at stake, I guess? What is that? So, you know, if you start with the Sodom and Gomorrah, what are they trying to say? Okay.
Well, they clearly say that this place is just really bad, and that when God destroys it later, I guess.
Okay, so for one, they're trying to say, why are they so bad that God would destroy it? Is there any parallel with that in the second one, in the Judges one? Anybody? How would you apply that? So, I mean, okay, Sodom's going to get destroyed. Should work for the first one. Why it's so bad? Why is it so bad in the second one? Gonna try?
It's the justification for the war.
Yeah, so it's the so I think it does work actually, right? That it's the justification for the war. So why are the people so bad that all Israel should go fight them? So okay, so but this is important at least, right? That it's not, the point isn't, you know, sex per se. It's to define badness. In one case, that is serious enough so that God can just wipe out people. In the other case, so that Israel can wipe out people. And in both cases, what they do is they go in and they don't just have a war, or, you know, God goes in and slaps people around. A lot of people die. The punishment is absolute. So then the question is, well, why is sex the best way to portray this? And why this sex? What do you think? What's bad about it? What's wrong with a little bit of mass rape? So what's wrong in this picture? What happens in both of these stories? What do both of these stories have in common?
Send a woman out.
Okay, they send a woman out, which is kind of interesting, right? Because in both cases, the townspeople aren't looking for a woman, per se. So what do you think about that? Yeah?
Well, I think that it shows how bad these men are. That, I mean, sex, because men are considered sort of above women, but according to this,
Okay.
but also to sort of subjugate a man is sort of even, like, more extreme.
I mean, I don't know if you follow that. So he was saying, well, I mean, at least in this setting, it seems like the women are treated as second-class citizens, and that if so far as the men are not, now, of course, in each case, they're foreigners, right? And I think that's actually going to be an essential part, is that even though they're men, they're outsiders, which is part of what opens the door to them being treated in this second-class kind of way, subordinating, oppressing kind of way. But I mean, it's actually a nice observation that to do this, to abuse men in this way would, in this setting, perhaps be treated as even more of a crime than treating women in this way. Although, one of the things that's funny about both stories is, for all the ancient context and that women may be, you know, embedded into these relationships with households and men where they are not of the same status, the Bible by no means kind of gives people permission to treat women in this way, or men. And there's this pattern again where they ask for the men and they're given the women. And at least the way I hear it, the people who are ready to hand over their daughters are being criticized. At least it strikes me this way, especially because it happens twice. And the way this Levite is being portrayed, he sort of like kicks the body on the doorstep and says, you know, what's wrong with you? And right? This is such a horrible picture of this man's attitude. Yeah?
I mean, in the first one though, it's not like the man who sent out his daughter is struck with blindness. I mean, he's not really punished.
Yeah.
It's the other man, and also, I mean, the concubine of the man.
Yeah.
Isn't she a foreigner too? So.
Well, right. I mean, an outsider with the Levite.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess I think that for sure the immediate situation requires that the community be held accountable to the degree of being punished with death. And for one, that the sexual crime is, even in the first case, wanting to do it, though they weren't actually allowed to do it. And then in the second case where they carry it out, though not on the person that they asked for. And I like your idea, though, that in a way, it's not that the violence would be any different between the woman they get and the Levite whom they wanted. But the fact that they wanted the Levite means they were going for like the highest status person. We're going to abuse and debase the highest status person of this foreign group that's shown up. And that's going to be the men. And then they're given, somebody lower status, and they do the same thing, right? They do an equally bad thing. And they're held accountable for it in that story. So I'm trying to remember your first question. Anyway, let me just keep going. Couple of things to run by you in this. So first of all, in this first story, this is partly, even the term sodomite comes from, which is this, right, and sodomy, which are these old terms for homosexual acts, show to what extent that this story is read as about homosexuality in a sense. But at least the thing to see right off is that the sexual wrong is not the homosexuality implied, but the violence expressed in it. And this is where I liked your whole line of thought, to think, what does it mean to go after these men, these foreign visiting men? It's an act of violence and kind of forced subordination. And it combines rape, which is an act of violence, with mass assault, in both cases as treatment of outsiders, a communal choice to punish them for daring to enter their domain. And it's like the ultimate way of scaring off anybody from visiting you. In both cases, they're saying, you do not belong here. And so then the question is, why use sex as a vehicle to express this kind of outrage? And somehow, it seems that it's worse than murder. It's a kind of torture. It's a humiliation. And then thinking about this, just to say something in terms of how this relates to families. So in this ancient world, all life is built on family bonds. So they're either the bonds that join families together as a family, or they join two separate families, which is what marriage does. And so in an interesting way, of course, sex is part of what joins separate families, right? That so far as sex is tied to marriage, like my other example, then it's an expression of what joins people, joins these kind of separate communities. And even so far as children are produced, then these children represent bonds between communities, households, families that were separate before they were joined. So what you should at least see in this is that this whole aspect of life, which is about joining people and building bonds, in this kind of story is turned inside out into the most effective possible way to show an absolute refusal to form bonds. And this becomes a basis for absolute war. Okay, one more set of texts. So now we're down to prophets. And I had two examples, but let me show you them both. So the first one is the prophet Hosea. It's the first of the short books of prophets. If you remember, there was Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Those are the three long books of prophets, writing associated with prophets. And then you start this set of 12. The first one of these is Hosea. It's probably one of the two oldest books of prophet-based writing in the Bible. And so it begins with, there it is at the top, this is the word of the Lord which was revealed to Hosea during the time when Uzziah and so on ruled. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, he said to him, "Go marry a prostitute who will bear illegitimate children conceived through prostitution, because the nation continually commits," this says spiritual prostitution, but I think its word's probably just prostitution, "by turning away from the Lord, Yahweh." So Hosea married Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim. Then she conceived and gave birth to a son for him. The Lord said to Hosea, "Name him Jezreel, because in a little while I will punish the dynasty of Jehu," which has a place called Jezreel as its sort of one of its capitals, has a palace there. And so he's going to put an end to the kingdom of Israel. "I will destroy the military power of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." So then it says she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to him, "Name her No Pity, Lo Ruchama, because I will no longer have pity on the nation of Israel." And so they go through that one. And then when she had weaned No Pity, she conceived again and gave birth to another son. Then the Lord said, "Name him Not My People, Lo Ami, because you are not my people and I am not your God." So isn't this a great sort of way of doing prophecy? So, of course, if you take this as, if you leave the God part out and say, well, whoever God may actually be in this picture, or at least you have somebody who thinks God is talking to him, and he thinks that he's supposed to marry this person who is at least identified as a prostitute, somebody who's worked as a prostitute already, again, whatever that terminology would mean. So at least it's not a normal marriage. He's had relationships with other men, and he's supposed to have children by her. And those children that come out of this relationship are all going to bear names. They're all going to be symbols of God's decision to destroy Israel because they've been unfaithful to him, which seems to be what the whole package means, is that, that Hosea's marriage to this woman is a model for how God sees his marriage to his people. So with all of this out there, let's just look at the one other one, which is the Ezekiel. Yeah. So then we get one of the most lurid passages in the whole Bible. And this is just this long prophecy. And it starts, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, confront Jerusalem." This is now after, so Ezekiel is supposed to have been taken away in exile to Babylon in the first set of exiles after the defeat by Babylon in 598, 597. But meanwhile, Judah is still a going concern back in Jerusalem and Judah. And so Ezekiel supposedly gives all these prophecies, waiting for something to happen. But it's pretty close to the end, right? So this is what he's saying. "This is what the sovereign Lord says to Jerusalem. Your origin and your birth were in the land of the Canaanites." And it talks about, her birth. "As for your birth, on the day you were born, your umbilical cord was not cut, nor were you washed in water. No eye took pity on you. You were thrown in an open field. Verse 6, I passed by you and saw you kicking around helplessly in your blood. I said to you as you lay there in your blood, live, I said to you as you lay there in your blood, live. I made you plentiful like sprouts in the field. You grew tall and came of age so you could wear jewelry. Your breasts had formed and your hair had grown, particular hair too maybe, but you were still naked and bare. Then I passed by you and watched you, noticing that you had reached the age for love. I spread my cloak over you, which would be the sort of symbolic act of marriage, and covered your nakedness. I swore a solemn oath to you and entered into a marriage covenant with you. Right? So God marries her. This is the whole metaphor. Okay, go with it. So then I bathed you in water, washed the blood off you. I mean, this is all symbolic. Gave her all this stuff, jewelry, bracelets. I put a ring in your nose, earrings, beautiful crown on your head. You're adorned with gold and silver, all this nice clothing. Your fame spread among the nations because of your beauty. But, verse 15, you trusted in your beauty and capitalized on your fame by becoming a prostitute. You offered your sexual favors to every man who passed by so that your beauty became his. You took off your clothing and engaged in prostitution on your clothing. You went into him to become his. You took your jewelry, sell yourself for that, take your embroidered clothing, use it to cover them. All this food, she feeds them. You took your sons and daughters whom you bore to me and you sacrificed them as food for the idols to eat, as if your prostitution was not enough. And it goes on and on. So this is the same image as Hosea, right? So again, you have the picture of God married to his people, but where he discovers that his people both, maybe in one case had been a prostitute, but then goes to acting, living out the life of a prostitute. And so, the power behind this image, I guess, lies in the sex that is in play, that what is intended to belong within the context, the safe context of the marriage. And we've, from the man's side, you could say, well, he wants to control her, he wants to possess her. Maybe. That's a good question, how you want to read that. But of course, we equally saw this in Genesis 30 from the woman's side, where this is her right, her security. It's the basis for her having standing in the world, for her being able to have children. All of these things, this character, Jerusalem, has given up and sort of slapped her husband in the face. I don't need you. I don't need any of that stuff from you. I'm rich, I'm beautiful, I've got all this stuff, I'm going to go give them to somebody else. And so in this context, then the whole package of sex and marriage ends up being used as a way to talk about religion, right? So never mind the Song of Songs and the potential analogy to the relationship with God. In this set of texts, we've got sex and the analogy for the relationship with God, and it's negative, right? So this time it's not the sort of positive picture of what you might imagine for desire. It's used as a way of talking about a broken relationship, but it is used to talk about religion. And it becomes, if you say, I want to talk about religion, I want to talk about God, I want to talk about what's going on between people and God, and sex becomes the most powerful way to sort of put that in people's face. So, and they're, again, not afraid to be extremely explicit. So overall, the point of all this is, don't let the sex distract you. Don't assume a sort of morality that is supposed to be the first issue in terms of the Bible when it talks about sex. Oh, are they doing it right? Oh, is it moral? Oh, is it what you're supposed to do? Oh, is it a model? But look at all these other ways in which sex is just such a powerful, hot, sort of category for looking at relationships, that it can be applied to the relationship between people and God. It can be applied to men and women. It can be applied to foreigners and insiders as a tool for sort of judging at that level, the Bible will absolutely resort to talking about sex when it wants to make a point powerfully. Okay, see you next time.